Think about this. For more than a decade, your life is an open book. Every dinner with the family, every fight, every birthday party, and every heartbreak dramatized on national TV for the world to see. You wake up not only as a parent or partner, but as a character in the public's eyes. And then, suddenly one day, all of it brings you into a courtroom, where your entire way of life is questioned, picked apart, and put on trial. That's not a script for a movie. That's the true story of Kody Brown, the man at the center of TLC's hit show Sister Wives. When Sister Wives originally aired in 2010, no one could have foreseen the tempest it would create. Fans watched thinking they would experience something odd, perhaps even scandalous, and what they discovered was a family unlike any other. Kody, with his bright blonde curls and boisterous personality, brought America his four wives, Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robin, and their 18 kids. The premise alone was incendiary. One man, several wives, all cohabitating as one big dysfunctional family. It was interesting to some. It was disturbing to others. But to all, it was impossible to ignore. Suddenly people got a front row seat to a way of life that most only heard whispers about or glimpsed in sensationalized documentaries. And in the earliest days, the Browns didn't merely wish to entertain. They wished to normalize. They wanted to prove to the world that they weren't criminals. They weren't in hiding, and they weren't monsters. They were merely a family who happened to live differently. But here's the catch. When the cameras recorded smiles, meals, and tearful talks, something far more nefarious lurked in the background. In Utah, where the Browns resided when the reality television show first premiered, polygamy was not merely disapproved of. It was a felony. That was the same thing that made them different. The same thing that attracted millions of viewers to their program could also land them in jail. The minute they opened their doors to America, they also opened those doors to law officers. The Browns understood that risk. They understood the law was not on their side. But they were also confident in their decision, in their lifestyle, and in their beliefs. And for Kody, appearing on national TV wasn't simply about fame. It was about making a point. It was about declaring, "We're not embarrassed and we won't live in fear." Still, that courageous position had its cost. Several months after the show aired, rumors of investigation began to swirl. Utah prosecutors began scrutinizing Kody and his wives. What may have appeared as reality TV fluff to the audience was, to the law, a confession acted out in real-time episodes. Consider having to live with the knowledge that your home movies could be used against you, that every time you referred to someone as "my wife," it could someday be used against you in a courtroom. That's the situation Kody and his wives lived with. For fans of the show, the family drama was the big attraction. Arguments between wives, the struggles of parenting, the tension of jealousy. But for the Browns themselves, there was always a bigger fear lurking just out of view. That knock at the door, that letter in the mail, that moment when someone would say, "You've gone too far." They weren't just battling with each other, they were battling the law. And that's when the story takes its dramatic turn. Kody Brown didn't just sit back and wait for the law to come crashing down on him. Instead, he took the fight directly into the heart of the system. He stepped into a courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a challenger. He and his wives decided to sue the state of Utah, claiming that laws against plural marriage were unconstitutional. In an instant, this wasn't simply about one man and four wives anymore. This was about freedom, rights, and whether love, when shared among more than two individuals, could ever be legal in America. But before the lawsuit, before the hearings and the decisions, there was the stunning start. The instant the Browns discovered they were not simply stars of a reality program, but potential offenders in the eyes of the state. The instant their fantasy of sharing their life with the world came into contact with the cold, hard barriers of the judicial system. It was no longer about reality television viewing figures. It was about survival. The irony is not to be missed. On the one hand, the show was making them celebrities in their own homes, enabling them to live their faith and lifestyle openly for the first time. On the other, that very openness was painting a bull's eye on their backs. Audience members giggled, wept, and argued over whether Kody was a good husband or a narcissist. But on the backstage, something far scarier was in preparation for the Browns. They weren't concerned about jealousy between wives or family conflict. They were concerned about whether Kody was going to jail, whether their kids would get to see their dad in handcuffs, whether all that they had worked for would be shattered in a single swift stroke of the law. Think about that for a moment. Imagine raising children under the weight of that fear. Imagine tucking them into bed at night, smiling for the cameras during the day, and all the while wondering if your entire life could be taken away in court. That's the reality Kody Brown faced. That's what made his story so much bigger than just reality TV drama. And yet, even in the face of fear, even in the face of danger, Kody and his wives were unflinching. They didn't hide. They didn't flee. They gazed directly into the cameras and said, "This is who we are. This is our family." And by doing so, they created the context for one of the most unconventional and contentious courtroom struggles in contemporary American history. The jaw-dropping start wasn't simply that Kody Brown televised his polygamous life. The jaw-dropping start was that in doing that, he made America confront something it had been avoiding for years. Should individuals be allowed to choose their own family arrangement, as long as it doesn't fit the classic picture? That was the ignition. That was when a family reality show suddenly became something much larger. A legal saga, a cultural phenomenon, and a story that would shadow Kody Brown for the remainder of his life. Because when you remove the lights, the cameras, and the reality TV headlines, you are left with something plain and basic: a man, his wives, his children, and the struggle to live in peace. But peace, as the Browns were to soon discover, does not always come easily. Sometimes it must be fought for. Sometimes it must be won in court. And that's the way the story really starts. Not with family intrigue, not with vengeful wives or disobedient children, but with a courtroom looming in the background, poised to render judgment on one very strange American family. Freedom, it's a word we hear so much. We honor it, we battle for it, we insist it's what makes life in America special. But what if your definition of freedom doesn't resemble everyone else's? What if the life you live is illegal? That was life for Kody Brown and his family. They had lived for years quietly in Utah, practicing plural marriage. It wasn't the secretive, clandestine world that everybody envisioned. They weren't living in some isolated desert compound. They weren't hiding from the world. Their children attended school. They shopped at grocery stores. They lived in ordinary houses. To outsiders, they seemed like any other big, busy family. But behind closed doors, their way of life violated one of Utah's strictest statutes. When Sister Wives premiered in 2010, all of this changed. Overnight, the Brown family was no longer faceless. They were no longer another quiet plural family going about their business in the background of Utah's suburbs. They were front and center, aired across the country, and with cameras present, they were truthful. Kody didn't call his wives roommates or friends. He didn't hide his children or pretend his family structure was something it wasn't. He said it plainly: "These are my wives, and this is our family." But those words, so simple on television, carried enormous weight in Utah. Because in Utah, polygamy wasn't just illegal. It was a felony, punishable by years in prison, and it wasn't just Kody at risk. By law, each wife could also be charged. That meant Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robin, all of them mothers raising children, could have been taken from their homes, prosecuted, and potentially locked away. Imagine the terror of knowing that what you call love, what you call family, the state calls a crime. It didn't take long for prosecutors to notice the Browns. After all, the evidence was right there on TV every week. And before long, the family learned that the Utah County Attorney's Office was investigating them for felony bigamy. That word, bigamy, echoed like a threat over their lives. The family suddenly faced the very real possibility of prison time. 18 children, torn apart from their parents. A husband separated from his wives. A family shattered not by envy or individual strife, but by the long reach of the law. The Browns might have panicked. They might have closed down the show, avoided the cameras, and scurried back into hiding. Plenty of other plural families existed that way, hushed, cloistered, praying the law would never catch up with them. But Kody wasn't like that. Rather than hide, he did something brash, something that would make most people too afraid to attempt it. He fought back. The family sued the state of Utah, claiming that the plural marriage ban infringed on their rights. The case was now called Brown v. Men, and it wasn't about the Browns alone. It was about every family who lived in fear, just because of the composition of their household. The Browns contended that adults who are consenting should be able to decide with whom they live, and whom they consider family, free from the states labeling them as criminals. For Kody, it was not just about staying out of jail, it was about principle. He had always been vocal about how he believed in plural marriage, stating that it was a part of his religion, a part of his calling, and a part of him. To him, the suit wasn't just about defending his family, it was about defending freedom itself. He wanted the world to understand that what he and his wives had created was not abuse, was not exploitation, but a life of love and community by choice. Certainly, the battle wasn't easy. Suing meant putting their lives into even more of the spotlight. Every aspect of their marriage and families could now be scrutinized in a courtroom. Their attorneys would plead their cases before judges. The media would analyze every statement. Strangers would have opinions, some applauding them, others condemning them as lawbreakers deserving whatever they got. The Browns were no longer reality television personalities. They were icons in a debate across the country about marriage, morality, and freedom. And all of this was going on while the Browns didn't miss a beat. They continued raising children, continued taping the show, continued dealing with the regular chaos of everyday life. But now they had a lawsuit weighing on their shoulders. Try grocery shopping or assisting with homework, while understanding that the name of your family sat on a court document filed in federal court. Picture grinning for photographers, shooting a television episode, while quietly wondering whether your husband might end up in jail. That was what the battle for freedom was like for the Browns. It wasn't soapbox speeches or film-themed courtroom theatrics to begin with. It was not talking back. It was late nights at the kitchen table. It was the wives huddling together, second-guessing themselves about whether or not they should have gone public. It was Kody digging in his heels and declaring that stealth was no longer on the table, that something needed to be done, and that stand would have consequences. Their critics labeled them irresponsible, accusing them of going on and living ostentatiously in front of the cameras to achieve fame and then complaining when the law fought back. Others hailed them as trailblazers, claiming they were courageous in pushing back against legislation many believed was discriminatory and obsolete. People may loathe them or adore them, but nobody could help but take notice. By opting to go to war, the Browns took their narrative from mere family drama to something much larger. Their reality show had opened the door, but their lawsuit hurled them into history. This was no longer merely Kody and his wives. It was for all those plural families sitting on the sidelines, families who had lived in terror for centuries. To them, the Browns were a voice, a symbol, a family who would risk everything to cry out, "We deserve freedom too." That was what made this season in their life so strong. It wasn't ratings, it wasn't fame, it was freedom. The freedom to choose love, to create family, and to live without handcuffs hanging over their heads. And as the Browns geared up for their court fight, they knew this one thing for sure. This was no longer about their fight alone. It was a battle for families like theirs, a battle that would challenge their strength, their solidarity, and their own faith. The moment had finally arrived when the Browns' private anxieties and hushed discussions in their own homes spilled out into the public domain of a courtroom. Having spent years living in the shadow of Utah's polygamy statutes, having spent months hearing rumors of prosecution, having taken a risk no one should ever have to take by filing their lawsuit, Kody Brown and his family were at the very epicenter of a legal tempest. The case was called Brown v. Bumian, after Kody's family and the Utah County attorney who could prosecute them. To outsiders, it may have seemed no more than another court case, one file among thousands that went through the system. To the Browns, however, it was life or death for the family they had struggled so hard to create. The courtroom was not merely a location of law. For the Browns, it had seemed like a battleground. On one hand, Prosecutors and state lawmakers contended that Utah's polygamy statutes were needed to ensure stability and defend society. They highlighted the extensive history of abuse in some polygamous sects, instances where women and children had endured forced marriage or authoritarian leadership. To them, polygamy wasn't all about consenting adults. It was a risky behavior that had hurt individuals in the past. Opposing them were the Browns, a family who had flung open their lives on national television to present something very different. They weren't concealing young brides. They weren't coercing individuals into wedlock. They weren't keeping their children away from the world. Instead, they occupied suburban houses, enrolled their children in school, and operated just like any other big, occasionally sloppy, occasionally affectionate family. Their attorneys maintained the Browns were not criminals. They were just adults exercising a choice regarding how they chose to live their lives. Within the courtroom, the stakes were huge. This wasn't about whether Kody Brown could marry several women and call them all his wives. It was about whether or not the government had the right to tell adults what type of family they could create. Should the state be allowed to disband families that lived in non-traditional ways? Or should adults be left free to love in whatever way it presented itself? For the Browns, the testimony was very intimate. Christine testified to how the investigation had left her feeling that she lived in fear, even though all she wanted to do was raise her children in peace. Janelle described the lawsuit as not being about encouraging polygamy. It was about being able to live without the threat of police at their door. Even Mary, who did struggle within the marriage, acknowledged that the burden of being treated as a criminal for loving her family was near impossible to bear. Kody himself, never afraid to speak up, stated that the case was one of freedom. He wasn't requesting the court to sanction or condone his lifestyle. He was requesting permission to live it in peace. His thesis was straightforward: we're not hurting anyone. Why should we be punished for our family? The drama wasn't limited to the courtroom. Outside, reporters descended. News headlines all over the country argued about the case. Some referred to the Browns as courageous pioneers battling an archaic law. Others ridiculed them, labeling them egocentric reality show participants who had invited problems the instant they exposed their lives on television. Camera flashes, microphone yells, and strangers online took sides in a fight that was both cultural and legal. For the Brown kids, courtroom theatrics were even more difficult to watch. Think of being a teenager, already grappling with identity and belonging, and then watching your family emblazoned on news headlines as lawbreakers. Some of the kids acknowledged they were embarrassed. Others were frightened, but they knew throughout their parents weren't giving up. Then in 2013, arrived the Browns' long-awaited moment. A federal judge had made a ruling. In a shocking decision, the court held that provisions of Utah's anti-polygamy statute were unconstitutional. The judge held that the state could continue to prohibit multiple marriage licenses, but that adults could not be prosecuted for merely cohabiting and referring to each other as family. For the Browns, it was a grand triumph. Finally, they could breathe. They could live freely without dreading a midnight visitation or a felony indictment. They had established that their struggle wasn't futile. The drama that had unfolded in the courtroom had given them a victory not only for themselves but for all plural families who lived in secrecy and terror. The celebration was tearful. Kody grinned triumphantly, asserting that freedom had prevailed. The wives were relieved, stating they could finally live knowing they no longer had the specter of prosecution hanging over their heads. For a moment, the Browns felt they had altered history. But as with all chapters in the Brown family saga, the triumph came with a twist. The court decision incited outrage. Opponents cautioned that making polygamy legal could pave the way for abuse in less healthy plural families. Politicians promised to battle back. The battle raged on, with the Browns caught in the middle, both lauded and vilified. And although the ruling spared them, the tale did not quite end. For in the American judicial system, victories can be appealed, challenged, and reversed. And the Browns were about to learn that their moment in the limelight of the courtroom was far from over. Even so, the courtroom melodrama of Brown v. Plumman was a turning point. For the first time in decades, a family had challenged Utah's anti-polygamy laws and prevailed, even if temporarily. For the Browns, legality was less than half the issue. It was about dignity. They had entered a courtroom not as TV celebrities, but as parents, partners, and believers, seeking the simple right to define their family as their own. And for home viewers, seeing the case unfold was like seeing history in the making. The same family they had watched navigate jealous fights, adolescent milestones, and holiday meals was now the focal point of a battle that could redefine the definition of freedom in America. The courtroom was their stage, but this time there were no cameras tagging behind them into the home afterwards. This was not scripted reality TV melodrama. This was real, honest, and life-altering. And whether the tale would bend and twist its way in the years to follow, the Browns would never forget the day they stood before the court, exposed their lives, and took the courage to say, "We have a right to live as we wish." Victory isn't always eternal. Sometimes it's temporary, such as cupping water in the palm of your hand, only to have it slip away between your fingers. For Kody Brown and his clan, that's precisely what occurred. In 2013, when the Browns were celebrating their victory in court, it was like waking up from a bad dream. After years of existing under the shadow of prosecution, after months of courtroom fights and media scrutiny, they finally received a verdict in their favor. A federal judge had ruled that essential components of Utah's anti-polygamy statute were unconstitutional. The Browns celebrated, thinking that finally, their family could breathe easy. For the first time, they weren't staying one step ahead of a prosecutor, watching anxiously for one of them to knock on their door. They believed they had won their liberty for life. But life always has a tendency to turn twists into even the most robust of triumphs. The state of Utah refused to allow the Browns' case to go unchallenged. Prosecutors and officials resisted, appealing and intent on overturning what they perceived as a reprehensible precedent. The Browns were not heroes in their eyes. They were criminals who had exploited the system for personal profit. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was far from over. The appeals process took forever, turning what had been a celebration into another grueling fight. It was a bitter irony for the Browns. They had already invested their hearts, their finances, and their guts in the lawsuit. They had already suffered through endless headlines, arguments, and scorn from others who didn't get their life. Now they had to endure it all again. And then there was the hammer blow. In 2016, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the family's win. The judges did not say the Browns were in error. They did not render the polygamy laws entirely constitutional. Rather, they threw the case out on a technicality. Their rationale: prosecutors in Utah had asserted that they weren't going to charge the Browns any longer, so the family wasn't actually at risk. In the court's view, the issue had already gone away. For the Browns, there was a sense of betrayal. Picture years of struggling for liberty, finally gaining it, and then hearing that your cause no longer counted. Not that you were incorrect, but that the state merely vowed to leave you in peace. For now, the statute remained intact, untouched, like a sword hanging above their heads. The Browns did not lose everything, yet they had not really gained anything either. It was a kind of legal limbo. The Browns were safe on paper. Prosecutors said they were not going to press charges, and so the family could live without the immediate threat of prison. But technically, the law still labeled them as criminals. That meant that at any moment, if public sentiment changed, or if a new prosecutor wished to make an example of them, their family could be in danger again. For Kody, the decision was catastrophic. He had envisioned not only safety for his own family, but for fundamental change. He wanted to redefine the rules, to create a world where no other plural family had to live in terror. And for a fleeting moment, it had seemed within reach. But now, the door was slammed in their faces. Their case was closed. The courts had turned their backs, leaving the Browns adrift in a world where the law continued to identify them as outsiders. The cost in terms of emotions was high. Christine, already troubled by skepticism about the plural lifestyle, felt the disappointment keenly. Janelle, ever pragmatic and even-tempered, confessed that the constant wars had taken a toll on her. Mary, who had her own tortured relationship with the family, viewed the decision as another reminder that their path had grown so much harder. And Robin, the baby wife, was most concerned about the children. How would they grow up in a world where their family wasn't supposed to be? The turn of events also elicited the cruel harshness of public life. People who had previously applauded the Browns now taunted them. The family had wasted everyone's time with a useless lawsuit, according to critics. Others simply contended that the overturned decision reaffirmed that polygamy didn't have anything to be protected. Social media was merciless, and the Browns, already weakened by intracorporeal struggles, had to feel the pain of public judgment once again. But under the anger and sorrow, there was also a stillness of strength. The Browns hadn't done everything they had set out to do, but they had made the world take notice. Prior to their lawsuit, polygamy was a forbidden subject, whispered about or tied in with fanatical abusive cults. But due to the Browns, due to their courage to go into the courtroom and into the public eye, the dialogue had shifted. Folks now could envision polygamous families being normal, messy, complicated, loving, and human. And that image, even in legal loss, counted. Yet the individual toll of the surprise rested profoundly on the family. Already cracks were beginning to develop in Kody's marriages by this point. Christine, once one of the loudest supporters of the family's lifestyle, was tiring of Kody's rule. Janelle questioned time and again whether the anxiety of endless public wars was worth it. Mary, already emotionally disconnected, started distancing herself even more. Robin, Kody's closest, bore a large amount of his frustration as he complained of the injustice of the system. For the children, the lesson was muddled. Some looked up to their parents' bravery, some longed in secret for their family to never have been so public, never to have been so willing to fight, never to have become America's face of polygamy. What had begun as a battle for freedom now weighed on them all like a burden. And yet, in the midst of all the discouragement, there was one thing that never changed. The Browns had taken the courage to do what few others had. They had stood before a court, aware of the danger, and defied one of the largest and most influential states in the country. Although the decision was later reversed, they had shown that their family would not be silenced. They had brought their tale from living rooms to courtrooms, reality TV to the front pages of newspapers. They had lit fires in churches, classrooms, and living rooms across America. The turn of fate was callous. Yes, their triumph had been fleeting. Their vision of enduring legal reform had gone up in flames. But the Browns' struggle had not been for nothing. They had made an impression, one which could not be removed by a reverse judgment or a rejected case. For Kody Brown, the court fight might not have turned out as he had hoped, but it was a representation of his greater life narrative, a narrative of drive, adversity, pride, and the constant pursuit of legitimacy in a society that never entirely accepted him. And for fans who had watched it all unfold, the message was plain. Sometimes liberty is not received in a moment of triumph. Sometimes it's a battle that never truly ends. Legacies don't accrue in one instant. They lead up, over years, in triumphs, setbacks, disappointments, and the strength to persevere, even when the prognosis looks grim. For Kody Brown, the legacy of his fight in the courtroom isn't about statutes or judges or court papers. It's about what his struggle laid bare. Not just about him, but about his family, his faith, and the world looking from the outside in. When the Browns initially brought their lawsuit, they were merely a reality television family, attempting to shield themselves from persecution. Yet, as the years went by, the case evolved into something more. It compelled America to ask questions about liberty, morality, and what constitutes a family. Must the state have a say in how adults live, even when nobody is being hurt? Should love, if it's shared by more than two individuals, be a crime? These were the questions reverberating long after the trial, sparking debates in living rooms, on college campuses, and even in political circles. The Browns did not win the war, but they did win something: intention. Prior to their battle, polygamy was an issue hidden deep in the bushes, linked almost entirely with secretive groups or sensational news stories about abuse. But by inserting their faces and their voices into the public eye, the Browns altered that mythology. They demonstrated that plural families could be just like any family, messy, complicated, loving, and flawed. They weren't monsters. They weren't criminals. They were human. That maybe is their greatest legacy. But for the Browns themselves, the courtroom fight left a scar. The stress of continuous criticism, the burden of public disapproval, and the frustration of legal defeats taxed their already strained relationships. The marriages gradually came apart. Christine, who had remained committed to the concept of plural family, finally left Kody, explaining that she could no longer be happy in their marriage. Janelle also distanced herself, opting for her autonomy over endless drama. Mary, his initial wife, who for long had felt abandoned, also left the union. When all the dust finally settled, Robin was the only one left. The husband who once boastfully brought 4 wives into the world now had only one. For many of the viewers, it was like the ultimate tragedy. Kody had battled so fiercely to justify plural marriage in court, to show that his way of life was deserving of protection, and yet his plural family had failed him from the inside out, and yet, even that irony contained truth. Because the Brown's tale was never actually a tale of perfection. It was a tale of the struggle to be real, even when the world resisted. The courtroom fight was like the family's internal struggles, ugly, complicated, unfinished. For the children, the legacy is more complicated. Some have quite directly stated that they don't intend to practice plural marriage when they have children of their own. Others still hold on to the sense of belonging it provided for them. Either way, though, they will always retain the knowledge that they came from a family that had the courage to stand up and state, "We may be different, but we want to have the same freedoms as everyone else." In a sense, that's what makes the Brown's tale appeal to so many, even those who don't approve of polygamy. It's not merely about marriage regulations, it's about the common need for acceptance. Who hasn't felt at some time during their life that the world didn't comprehend them? Who hasn't craved the right to live without fear of condemnation? The Browns' battle in the courtroom might be unique to their way of life, but feelings behind it are ones everybody can relate to. In hindsight now, years since courtroom doors shut, the Browns' suit is still a turning point in Sister Wives history. It provided the show with more substance than simple reality TV melodrama. It illustrated to audiences that behind all the jealousy, arguments, and family celebrations was a very much larger struggle taking place. One for dignity, acknowledgement, and survival. For Kody, the legacy is complicated. On the one hand, he will forever be known as the man who challenged the state of Utah, who argued in court for freedom for his family. On the other, he will also be known as the father whose vision of uniting his plural family was disintegrated before the eyes of the world. That contrast between triumph and defeat, between pride and sorrow, is what makes his narrative so compelling. But perhaps the most important part of this legacy is the conversation it sparked. Even today, people debate polygamy differently because of the Browns. Some believe their story proved that polygamy can be practiced in healthy, consensual ways. Others believe it highlighted the inevitable challenges and conflicts of such a lifestyle. Either way, the Browns forced people to think, to question, to talk. And that in itself is a legacy few families can claim. For YouTube audiences watching this unfold, the Browns' courtroom struggle isn't merely a footnote in legal history. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles don't result in the easy win or loss. Sometimes, they leave us in the gray, trying to figure out what freedom really means. The Browns did not receive the comprehensive overhaul that they desired, but they did confirm that one family, even one on reality television, can speak truth to power and make their voices heard. And that's the enduring legacy of their tale. Not the overturned decision, not the procedural nicety that brought their case to an end, but the guts it took to stand, to risk everything, and to fight for the basic right to be as they were. Whether you love Kody Brown or you hate him, whether you believe in plural marriage or you oppose it, there is no denying one thing. The Browns shifted the conversation. Their court fight, complete with its twists and turns, was more than a mere court battle. It became a symbol of what freedom looks like when you live in a world that doesn't always get you. And so, as we finish this chapter in their history, we're left with a reality that's greater than the Browns themselves. Freedom isn't ever clean. It isn't ever guaranteed. And it doesn't always arrive in the way that we want it to. Occasionally, freedom is just the act of standing, of refusing to cower, of being "this is who we are, and we have the right to be." That is the legacy of Kody Brown. That is the legacy of the courtroom struggle that shook not just his family, but the way America understands family itself.